So I'm a state extension specialist over at Purdue, and I primarily work with corn. And as we talk about on-farm research, because I'm a state extension specialist, I think that's flavored how I've gone about working with on-farm research, and I'll try to share that with you as we go forward. So I've been at Purdue since the early 80s. When I got there as a young person fresh out of graduate school, and I was all hot to trot to get into field research. Because I was an extension, I really wanted to try and do research on farm, as well as on the outlying Purdue farms. And so back in the day when I would do on farm research, what it was basically me talking to a farmer and saying, I need about 3 acres out of your field. Would you be willing to give me 3 acres? And I'll bring down my small plot equipment, I'll take care of the planting, and I'll take care of the harvesting, and all you need to do is to prep the field for me kind of deal. And that was sort of my on-farm research. The farmer had little to do with it other than saying, yes, you can go in my field, you can go there anytime you want, yes, I'll work the ground for you. Other than that, it really wasn't what I'd call collaborative on-farm research. And so we'd end up putting small plots, like you see in this old photo from 1998, out in somebody's field, and we'd come in and plant and come in and take notes during the summer and come in and harvest in the fall. And you know, frankly, often we didn't see the farmer very much. And because the farmer had to work up this little tiny area inside of a bigger field and maybe even, you know, plant around it because he was in a hurry to plant and we weren't ready to plant, so he had to plant around that silly area. It was a nuisance. And now when I was young, I didn't realize this because this was cool stuff. I was actually doing work on someone's farm and I didn't realize what a nuisance this was. And of course I was ingrained with small plots. You know, 4 rows by 25 feet and a bunch of them scattered, you know, like you see there. And that's the kind of research I was doing. Well, times have changed. And now since about 2006, for reasons that will become apparent, I began doing more with field research that was truly field scale. And so now, when we're talking field scale research, we're talking about trials. Most of them range from 30 to 80 acres. A few are smaller, and a few are much bigger, but most of them fall between 30 and 80 acre fields. Individual plots in those trials range from basically 12 to 24 rows wide, and by length of field. Not the small postage stamp size plots. We're using the farmer's equipment, not our own, and we're using the whistles and bells the farmer has on the equipment in terms of precision ag technology, as well as some software on the front side and the back side that we do. But we're using the farmer's technologies, and we're using mapping software and GIS software to design the trial ahead of time on computer, sometimes uploading it to a particular controller that the farmer is using. And then on the back side, when we get the yield data from the monitor, we're using the same software to manage that and to arrive at the summaries that we do. So today we're doing what I consider to be truly collaborative on-farm research with growers. And so sometimes, you know, people wonder, well, geez, it sounds like a little bit of Mickey Mouse. Why should I get involved with on-farm research with you guys? And I think the simple answer is that it gives you an opportunity to learn something that might improve yields and profit. I mean, from your perspective as growers, that's really what you want to get out of it, is you want to learn something in this trial that you can use on the rest of your farm. So that's the easy answer for why you might want to be involved. For us as researchers, I've got colleagues who don't do this kind of large-scale research, and they often ask me, well, why do I want to get involved with this field-scale research? Because it sounds like a lot of headaches. Well, because of the precision ag technologies that we have today, which makes life a lot easier for growers that collaborate with us, that results in more farmers that are willing to do it. And therefore, in addition to the data we can generate off similar sized plots at our outlying Purdue farms, I can now increase that database by getting data from on-farm trials in collaboration with growers. So we get more data for the database. And then it's always been true that results from on-farm trials have been more credible with farmers. And because the research is more credible, any guidelines we develop from that data are more credible because they involve real-world data. And because the guidelines are more credible, they're more likely to be adopted. And this is where, as a state extension specialist, my responsibility to serve all corn growers in the state, my responsibility is to develop guidelines either on a statewide basis at the most or on a regional basis for the growers in regions of the state. So my goal has always been to generate as much data as I can in as short a time as I can, covering as much of the state as I can in order to come up with good guidelines. All right? And so for me, this has been sort of a win-win situation to get involved with this kind of research. And these precision ag technologies have clearly been the key. Before we had this, there were so many logistical headaches for a grower to get involved doing field scale research that it was just too much for you as the grower to get involved with. And so we just didn't do much of it because it was, frankly, a pain in the butt to do. Let's say to do sound research and well-designed research, replicated, randomized, the kind of stuff we want as researchers, it was a pain in the butt. So these technologies allow us to not only design the trials, but also to implement them with the technologies in a fairly seamless way for growers so that the logistical challenges are greatly minimized. And in fact, in many cases, to a certain degree, the farmer almost doesn't have to know what's going on because it's all being done behind the scenes with the prescriptions or with the yield mapping or whatever. And let me go back to this. So this is one of our nitrogen trials this past year. This is a fellow up in Miami County near Peru, Indiana. Big hog grower, applies a lot of manure across his operation. We've worked with him, excuse me, for a couple years now because he has a question with all this manure that he's using, how much can he cut back on his nitrogen fertilizer? He's used PSNT, he's done end of season stock nitrate samples. None of them have been terribly good predictors, and so we hooked up with him a couple years ago and we've been doing some trials. And so over the past several years, so when we do trials with farmers, like a nitrogen trial, we often don't ask them to go terribly low on the fertilizer rates because of the potential for losing yield. And so we sort of push him a little bit, and for the last couple of years, we've not been able to get any yield response above about somewhere between 60 and 80 pounds of N. All right, and so we are feeling pretty good that, boy, it looks like you don't need a lot of N. This past year, I said, how gutsy are you? I said, we might be able to get by with only starter nitrogen, maybe only 30, 40 pounds. We just don't know, but the data suggests that, we don't really know where that maximum is yet. And so, to his credit, because he wanted to learn, he said, okay, I'll go starter only. This field was a early August applied manure field. And we had another 80 acres that was a November applied with him. So you can imagine, right, August versus November manure application, you're maybe more likely to lose that nitrogen on the August than you are on the November. But we still went ahead with the lowest rate in the trial was starter only. Well, this is, I want to say it's sometime in early August, and you can see the starter only strips. And so it was clear from the aerial imagery that, okay, this year that starter only was not going to give him maximum yield. You can almost pick out the rate above the zero, which I forget how much that was, but you can almost pick out a range of other rates in the field. On this same day when we flew the other field, which was the November manure field, you could hardly see any of this. All right, again, illustrating this difference in timing. Well, these are things the farmer was interested in. And so he was willing to take a bit of a hit to learn. And so I think we'll probably stay with him next year. But again, sort of get back to the story, it's the technologies that allow us to even consider doing this with a grower because it simplifies life to a large degree. Yield monitors were the first piece of the technology that allowed us to think field scale, because what that did was free us from the weigh wagons and weighing every single plot with a weigh wagon. It freed us from that, and it also allowed us to go even bigger scale because with the old seed company weigh wagons, you just couldn't easily weigh grain off of a very big plot. So it allowed us to get even bigger and end our reliance on the weigh wagons. Because we as the researchers are using the yield data, we don't really even have to record any, say, plot average yields when we harvest. Now we do, mostly as a paper trail in case the yield monitor blows up before we get the data out of it. So we do record the average yield on the monitor after every plot, but we don't have to. And so the farmer just harvests nonstop. Once we calibrate it, and sometimes that takes a little bit of time, but once we calibrate it, we just harvest nonstop. And so that takes away a lot of the headaches for the grower. We can use odd-shaped fields now. In the old days, we could use odd-shaped fields in the old days, but because we had to know the length of every plot so that we could calculate the area, so that we could calculate yield based on the weights of the weigh wagon, now we don't have to do it, so we can take any shaped field that we want to do with this. It allowed us to remove anomalous yield data. That's the same kind of data as squirrely yield data. All right, stuff that's weird. The wet holes that affects 2 plots but not the other 6. And so we don't want that to skew the results. And so we're able to get rid of that by working with the yield data. And in these large fields, when we're talking 50, 80 acre or whatever, invariably there's some really nice distribution of soil types or distribution of elevation zones, or maybe the guy has some Varus data on conductivity and we can come up with conductivity zones. Point being, we have a lot of spatial zones that are possible in these large fields. So when we do these trials, we can, as we work with the data, we can extract the data from just this soil type and analyze it for the, say, the response to end rates, and we can extract it from that soil type and look at that response. So it allows us to look at spatial responses that we simply could not do using just weigh wagons weighing the whole darn plot. Okay, so it's allowed us to move, not only use the technologies to do the trial, but actually learn from the data something we might use to further use the technologies in the real world. Okay. Now, I've got colleagues, John, that say you can't use yield monitors. They're not accurate enough. You just can't use these to detect differences in the field. Well, I've done this now for 13 years, and let me assure you, we can calibrate yield monitors down to a gnat's whisker in most cases. And you can easily calibrate them down to less than 1% error on the grain weight estimates. And this is a screenshot from this combine that day that by the time we got done calibrating, we had an average error of 0.2%. And I dare say that is plenty good for doing field research. So we've learned that it's worth the little bit of time up front to calibrate if it's not already calibrated. But we can usually dial it in and get it to extremely accurate numbers. So we've always felt good about the data that we're getting off these things. So again, these large fields almost always give us some kind of zones. Soil type's the easiest one to think of. And so what this is showing, this is one of our trials. It's a 150-acre plant population trial. The plot layer is, you can see underneath this data, you can see the underlying plot layer. Each of these colors is a different seeding rate. 150-acre trial, these individual plots were 16 rows wide. And this was a 150 acres squeezed into a rectangle, so these are basically a mile through on the individual plots. This nicely colored pattern of stuff that is here, that's the yield data. All right, that's the yield map from the monitor, but the colors don't represent yield. If you've done this, you realize you can map for yield, you can map for moisture, you can map for elevation, because all that data is in the yield file. Well, when you work with this kind of data, we can also take the yield data and we can conceptually merge it with the underlying plot layer, so that every one of the data points I can assign the plot, the rep to it. And similarly, we can take the underlying soil map, merge it with the yield data, and assign the soil type to every data point in the field. That's what I'm showing you on here. What you're looking at are the soil types in the field. It's the yield data we're looking at, but it's the soil type attribute that I'm mapping. Well, once I've got the soil type latched on to these data points, then I can query the GIS and say, okay, give me all of the Brookston silt loams and pull them out of there, okay? And so, and to keep it simple, I can pull all the purple data from this trial and analyze for yield response to population just for the purple soils. I can do the same for every other soil type in there. And in this case, there's 7 soil types in this field. So on this 150-acre trial, I basically have 7 trials for the price of 1. Because I've got 7 opportunities to look at yield response to tell me whether yield response to population is different in the purple than it is in the blue. If it is, I know I can use variable rate seeding. If it's the same response, I don't need to use variable rate seeding. That's the beauty of this field scale trial. For things like variable population or nitrogen, we can actually do this kind of stuff and look at this individual data and the responses in order to answer those questions. So I mentioned variable rate controllers. We design the trials with FarmWorks, with SMS Ag Leader, and there's several other programs we can use. And so once we design the trial and assign the treatments, and this represents 6 different nitrogen rates, replicated 5 times across the field. So every color is a different nitrogen rate, and there's 5 of them of each color across that field. And so that's the plot map. And I can take that in the software, export it as a prescription file that we upload to the controller in the applicator tractor, and then just side dress. The farmer's just side dressing. The farmer isn't worrying about changing this or changing that. He's just side dressing across the field, and it's all being done for him. And suddenly we got a neat trial. Okay. Now, if the farmer doesn't have the variable rate controls, we can still minimize the logistics of doing this kind of a trial by relying on the Autosteer. And of course, if you use Autosteer, you know as you're looking at the monitor, typically where you start in the field, it's swath number 0, and then it'll go 1 right, 2 right, 3 right, or 1 left, 2 left, etc. I mean, they're numbered. And so knowing that, if you don't have a variable rate controller, we can say, okay, we know, because we know where the 0 swath is, and we know that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So we can say, okay, we know that for treatment number 1, for that 1 nitrogen rate, we know that it's going to be swath number 4, 10, 21, 26, and 33. And so we're just going to navigate through the field, and we get to the end of swath 4. We're going to, admittedly, this is a bit of a paying attention deal. That is, we end swath number 4 and we're going down the end rows, we're watching the monitor and looking for swath number 10, and when we get to it, we just click on the Autosteer, pull in, and start side dressing, right? It's a bit more of a nuisance than a true variable rate prescription, but if a grower has a real interest in the trial, they're more than willing to do this. And so we do all of 1 rate, get to the end of 33, and we either change it from the cab, if he can at least do that, or if we have to get out and change sprockets, we'll do that. All right, but it's doable. All right. And in fact, we were doing this kind of stuff before variable rate came along. All right, we thought that was pretty cool stuff to be able to do this. And then when variable rate came along, that simplified it even more. We capture a lot of data. And John talks a lot about all this captured data that we get off these machines. So we get as-applied data for almost everything we do. So in a trial like this, we can capture the estimate of the nitrogen that was put on each of these strips. We use that to double check that the plot layer we designed, that it actually put out what we wanted it to put out. And if it didn't, if it made mistakes, we can document where they are. And maybe if we probably won't change our harvest strategy, but we may end up cleaning or removing data if it's been affected. We had a trial this year on I think it was about a 100-acre field. It was a sulfur trial, and we had 10 replicates of these treatments across this field. And at side dress time, we were doing some of the last sulfur applications in the side dress. And riding shotgun, we could sort of tell the flow meter looked like it was acting up. But, you know, when you're riding shotgun or driving, you just sort of hope it's not enough to screw up the whole trial. But then when we got the data and looked at it, this is not it. But when we looked at that as-applied data, about 4 of those 10 reps, there were so many hiccups of that flow meter going down those plots, we ended up not being able to use those reps of the trial. So the bad news is we lost reps. The good news is we knew to lose reps. Because otherwise, I mean, I think back over the years, John, before this as-applied data, and I think back to all these trials like N-rates where we pretty sure we were putting out the rates. We had no way of knowing. And I just sort of think, how many times did we in fact have a screwball study because it wasn't putting out what we wanted, but we had no way to check, right? And now we have all this great data that we can wade through to do that. So one of my messages is, on-farm research, field-scale research is easy. It is easy to do with today's technologies, but it does require some smarts and a willingness to spend some, pay attention to do it right. You can't just do it willy-nilly. There are just things that have to be done correctly. So this is sort of my sketch of a diagram of what I think it takes to have successful on-farm trials from both the farmer's perspective and our perspective. And so think of it as these are the things that both sides are bringing to the table as we do on-farm research. The farmer obviously has the land, the equipment, the precision ag technologies. In order to be successful, the farmer needs to bring a genuine interest, needs to bring some patience, because sometimes it ain't easy working with us yahoos from the university, and needs to have a natural ability for good attention to detail. And not everybody has that, unfortunately. From our perspective as researchers, we're also bringing the interest and the patience in this, but we're obviously bringing our research skills. We're bringing our ability to not only collect data, but analyze data, and then our willingness to spend time in the field, essentially doing field scouting while we're collecting other data, right? When all this comes together on both sides, except for Mother Nature and what that can do, you've got a successful program, and it can work so slick and be so successful. But again, it cannot be done willy-nilly. There has to be some sort of a focused research methodology followed, which is what we bring to the table as researchers. We've got that experience, we've got the know-how, and we've got the ability to help direct and make sure things are done correctly. So let me just walk you through briefly what we call the scientific method. So the first step in this research methodology is coming up with the question that you're trying to answer. And you might think, well, duh, that seems obvious. But I don't know, John, if you get this with some of your grad students, but sometimes when we ask them, what's the question you're trying to answer with your research, sometimes it's really hard for them to clarify it. All right? And the same is true for on-farm research. I mean, so part of the challenge is actually, what is the question I'm trying to answer? And then along with that is sort of then, well, what's my hypothesis? The question is, or maybe the challenge is, I want to control disease, or I think disease is a problem, and the hypothesis is, well, if I go in with azoxystrobin at brown silk, my hypothesis is I'm going to improve yield. All right, something that simple. And once you've identified the question and the hypothesis, then the treatments sort of jump out as to what are the relevant treatments. It's so easy to sort of just put treatments in the field willy-nilly without really thinking about them. But if we have the focus on the question and hypothesis, it helps us identify the relevant treatments. And then from our perspective as the researchers, we plan the trial, we get everything laid out, and we help implement the research in the field. And then, of course, we're collecting data and take notes that are going to help answer these two parts up there. And eventually analyze the data, interpret the results, which, interestingly, sometimes interpretation is a challenge too. And once we get basically to the end of that year, usually we repeat that research. All right. the reason we repeat trials is to look for consistency. How well does this treatment do the same thing in different growing conditions? And so you can't just do one trial 1 year and really learn anything from it, the substance. They're not very reliable. So we may go through this cycle several times, and eventually we say, okay, we've learned enough, but it's generated some more questions. So it takes us off another trail. All right. This is sort of the scientific method. It's sort of common sense, I think, but I'm not sure that it's always thought of as in clear terms. So again, I emphasize we repeat research because the growing conditions are rarely the same 1 year to another. This is a 30-acre field of continuous corn, and it's yield maps of 4 consecutive growing seasons. The colors in the yield legend are the same every year. So red means the same yield range, and dark green means the same yield range. And so within this 30-acre field in 4 consecutive years, we get at least 2, if not 3, different looks of a yield map. Okay? And it's just a reinforcement that growing conditions vary 1 year to another. And so if we're looking at, whether it's N rates or populations or whatever, but if we're looking at it in years where we have a lot of low yielding environments versus years with good yielding environments, we're trying to figure out, is there consistency in the response? All right, we know yields vary, but if we say that the optimum N rate's going to be, say, 180 pounds, is it always 180 pounds no matter what kind of growing conditions? So that's why we repeat research on fields, because we're looking at this genetics by management, by environment interaction, and all this stuff interacts with each other. And again, we're looking for consistency of responses across a range of growing conditions. The fact that we farm in the real world is one of the greatest challenges of conducting research. And I tease my more scholarly research colleagues who do all of their work in a nicely controlled laboratory, and they think they're doing such highfalutin research for some reason. And I always say, John, let's see how good you really are. Come with me to the field and do research, and see if you think that you're still doing such a great job. Because what we do in the field is infinitely more challenging than working under controlled conditions, because we're trying to figure out for you guys what is it that you can do that's going to improve yields consistently. And that requires looking at different growing environments. And it makes life a whole lot more challenging. So when you consider on-farm research or your customers, I would encourage you to avoid the lone wolf mentality, which is basically doing it alone. The power of on-farm research isn't just what individual farmers learn by doing their trial on their farm. That's not the power of on-farm research. Even if you do it for 2 or 3 or 4 years on your farm, you're not going to learn as much as you need to learn. The real power of on-farm research is when you can aggregate results from a lot of trials, particularly in a region of the state or maybe even statewide. But the power comes from aggregating results from multiple trials, because when you're getting a bunch of trials in a region of the state, you're going to get a range of growing conditions. You're going to get a lot better idea of the repeatability of the results. And again, for us as a state extension specialist, what I want to do is come up with reliable recommendations for a broad set of conditions. And so the power from both on-farm research and field scale at university farms is this ability to aggregate. So the process, at least what I go through when we do on-farm research, is we initiate discussions with the grower. We talk about the objectives, their interests. We talk about their available fields, their equipment, the technologies that they have, and we spend a lot of time going through all these details as we talk about the research. And we may look at a field or two and then figure out, okay, how many treatments, what kind of plot size, what would it look like? And we have all this discussion now. And really, John, I shouldn't even be here because I've got a number of farmers I need to be visiting with over the next week or so. We go through this now, talking through all this stuff. And especially for new cooperators, this is really important, because I want to feel comfortable that I've found a guy who's got good equipment and the right technology and whatever, but the farmer has to decide whether they're interested enough to get involved. And sometimes the equipment takes us astray, sometimes the other logistics do, and sometimes I walk away from discussions without a cooperator, because you just decide, no, I for various reasons I don't want to play, and that's fine. That's why we have our discussions in the wintertime and whatever. But boy, if a light bulb comes on and everything else sort of clicks, it's like, okay, all right, let's go. That's why we have these meetings at that time of year. A couple definitions, partly to make sure that we talk the same things, and this is sort of nitpicky, but sometimes the words plot and trial get confused. I want to make sure that you understand the difference. So the plot is the individual treatment in the field. This is a simple experiment. It's only got 3 treatments. They're replicated 3 times. One plot is one treatment in the field, so this might be a 12-row plot by length of field. So that's one plot. Sometimes people say the trial is the plot, and that's why I bring this up. The trial is the whole kit and caboodle. It's all of the individual plots and representing the replications of the treatments, right? Nitpicky, but just a little bit of definitions. When we think, people say, well, how large of a field do you need? Well, it really depends on the number of treatments that we're going to come up with, your equipment size, the shape of maybe of the field to a certain degree. Typically, the trials we do have somewhere between 15 and 35 individual plots. So clearly, something with 35 plots with 12-row equipment, that takes a lot more field space than 15. And as I already said, the trials typically range from 30 to 80 acres is the bulk of what we've done. And sometimes when we visit with potential new cooperators, they say, well, I've got an 80-acre field, well, that's probably bigger than you want, because they say they're thinking that there's too much variability in an 80-acre field for us. And we say, no, no, no. Contrary to public opinion, bigger is actually better. We don't care about the variability. In fact, we welcome the variability to a limit, because the more variability is, the more possibility we can tease out responses within the zones, right? The length of the trial is typically the length of the field. So depending on, if it's a 30-acre field or 80 or whatever, but it can be up to a half mile long, maybe up to a mile. We really don't care. I don't like putting in, say, shorter trials inside of a field. Like if it's a 1,300-foot long field, I don't want to put in a 300-foot trial in the middle of it. It's too much headache for you. And actually, the variability gets sort of worse in that 300-foot area than the whole field. So we try to go field length in the whole field if we can. The width of the plot is determined by the width of all the equipment that's used. The planter, the combine, the sprayer, the applicator, anything that's going to be used. So we're always looking for compatibility. But typically, the width of the plot is typically twice the width of the header. So because we want to harvest the middle of the plot for data, and the in-between strips we sort of use as bulk. Because if we're doing a nitrogen rate trial and we have a 200-pound rate next to a 50-pound rate, there's a little bit of bleed over we want to avoid. And so we set them up so that we take the middles out for data, and these in-betweens are just left as bulk. Now at the Purdue farms, where I guess we have the luxury of time, we take out all the middles first. And then once we get that done, they come back and glean the in-betweens. In the real world, when we work with growers, we just let them harvest the whole field right across the field, because afterwards I'm going to extract the middles from the data once I get it into my software. So the farmer can just harvest like they always harvest. It doesn't matter how they do it as long as they harvest it. So basically that's the way we're set up doing that. Trials there's a lot of different ways we can design a trial. One of the most common terms is a randomized complete block design. Blocks are like reps or replicates. So here's the same little simple trial. There's 3 reps or 3 blocks in this field, and within each rep are the treatments. All right, and so And so the blocks are these three groupings of plots right there. And then every rep, every individual block or rep has all the treatments. So rep number 1, rep number 2, rep number 3, they all have treatments 1 through 3. And then the treatment sequence inside each block is a different sequence. We're randomizing. And the reason we randomize is to try to avoid any sort of squirrely influence of that sequence on the response of that treatment in question. We replicate treatments for two reasons. One, which you don't care about, is that it allows us to do the mathematics of the statistics, pure and simple. Without replication, we can't do the analysis very easily. For your perspective, repeating these treatments in a trial allows us to look at that consistency of performance. If this hybrid looks to be the better hybrid, is it better in every rep? We're looking for consistency, okay? So here's an example that I used to try and illustrate inconsistent effects of treatments. This is a nitrogen timing trial that we had 2 years ago. We had a collaborator that had his own Hagee with a toolbar. The co-op was willing to bring in their Hagee with Y drops. And so we set up a trial to sort of look at this late application, which is sort of the craze these days, and different timings. The V3, V9, V12 represent growth stages of the crop. So 3-leaf, 9-leaf, 12-leaf corn. These numbers represent how much nitrogen applied at each growth stage. So we had one treatment where all of it was put on at V3, another treatment where part of it at V3, part of it at V9, et cetera, et cetera. H is the Hagee and the Hagee toolbar, YD is the Y drop, just to sort of put it in perspective. This is not important for the illustration. I'll show you the rep data here in a bit. But when I give you a report back, I never show you the individual rep data. I show you the means, the averages. All right? So when you look at these averages, it goes from 218 up to 225, 7 bushel spread. And so it's tempting when we look at the means and look at this 225, maybe the 224, and say, boy, they look better than the 219 and the 218. I mean, numerically they are better. But you know us, we do statistics, we slap on this thing called an LSD, and the LSD for this trial is 10 bushel, which says that the difference between any of these has to be at least 10 bushel before we'd say it was real. And you've heard us talk like this before. Are the differences real or are they not? So I'd look at that range of 7, I say, they're not real. It's not significant. And then you walk away rolling your eyes saying, well, my God, that was 7 bushel. Even a 350 corn, that's a little bit of, right? But we never show you the rep data and why we end up saying things like it ain't real, okay? So if we show you the rep data, I hope it would make a little more sense why we look at these means and then say, we don't think it's real. Because, for example, in rep number 1, this treatment was the highest yielding, and this treatment was the lowest. In rep number 2, another one was highest, and in fact, this one, which was highest in the first one, was actually lowest in the second one, and you see how that goes. The green is the highest in every rep, the red is the lowest. There's a lot of just sort of flip-flopping of high and low treatments, right? It's this flip-flopping that bothers us. Even though on average, on average, this one looks pretty good and that one looks pretty good, but in this one in particular, one of the 3 reps, it was the lowest, one it was the highest, and one it was in between. It's this inconsistency that eventually leads us to say things are not significant. We're looking for repeatability. In other words, we want the green to be the same treatment in every rep. And if it were, the statistics would tell us it's significant. All right, so that's why we do this kind of thing. And again, I've already talked about randomization. I won't talk about it again. Now, briefly, the workflow I go through to design trials, and I'm not promoting anybody's software, I'm just telling you what I happen to use. So I use FarmWorks from Trimble to design the trial on the computer, using the field boundary of a field, which in this case is this thin red line going around the field. And I use FarmWorks then. It's got a tool in FarmWorks called the buffer tool. It's not meant to be used for plot design, but it actually can be used in that fashion. And so with the buffer tool, I can take that plot boundary, and I use the south edge of this boundary as my straight line, and I use this tool to simply create a bunch of 12-row plots. And I can also create end rows going around it. All right, so I get a bunch of and I know how many they are, you know, because they fit right into that boundary. So I know how many plots I can work with, and then I start assigning reps to each of those. And now I've just shown you how it colors out. Here's 4 reps in this field. So these are reps with 6 treatments in every one of them. And then I assign the actual treatments to the individual plots to come up with this. And let's say this is a nitrogen trial. So yellow is one rate, red is another. And then, of course, once I'm at this point, and you've got a variable rate controller, then I export that as a shapefile and give it to you, and you upload it to your controller, and you're off to the races. All right. So I do all this work on the front end, designing the trial, making sure it fits in the field and everything's going to work, and then just send you the prescription files that you upload. And if you got the technology, it works really sweet. Research is about collecting data. It's not just yield data at the end of the year, but when we're collaborating with folks, we try to get out there pretty often collecting data. And so we're doing simple field scouting. We're maybe doing some plant height measurements or whatever. Increasingly, we're using drones to simply capture reflectance data, and with the hope that we can start using the reflectance imagery as actual data that we can manage and analyze like we do any other piece of data. And so we're capturing a number of different kinds of reflectance with our drones. We're also using the drones and aerial imagery to find squirrely things in the field, like where are the wet holes, where is the pore stand, etc. Because at the end of the day, I want to sort of remove some of that before I analyze the data. And drones are great for allowing us to do that. We've already talked about yield monitor calibration. I won't belabor that. Once I get the yield data, I'll just show you briefly the workflow I go through on that. This is an 80-acre trial. It happened to be another wide drop trial. 80-acre trial. Among other things, you see a lot of variability in yield that appears to have nothing to do with the wide drop versus anything else, right? They're just the usual field variability, the wet holes or whatever. And so I'm looking at that and already thinking, okay, I've got a little bit of cleaning to do in here to make the data usable. But I happen to use AgLeader SMS to import and do the initial processing of the data. I'm not promoting AgLeader per se, but because I work with a lot of different yield monitors, a lot of different formats of yield data, AgLeader is one of the most broadly compatible softwares that will read data from a lot of different kinds of monitors, so that's what I happen to use. And so I'll import the yield data with AgLeader SMS and do the initial processing, which means making sure the GPS offset is correct, making sure the time lag from the first hitting the plates till it hits the yield monitor, making sure that's set correctly, and I do this just the initial processing of the data. I export that to a simple shapefile format, and then I go into a GIS program. I could use ArcView, which is sort of the Cadillac of GIS, except, one, I get it for free at Purdue because we have a site license. But if you want to get into ArcView, you're talking 5,000 or 6,000, right, at least. So I got thinking, okay, if I want to develop recipes for you to process your own data, maybe I should look at some open source programs. So QGIS is a free open source program. Actually, it's pretty sweet. The more I work with this, John, the more I like it. So I'm using this open source GIS program to actually clean the data and to do those virtual mergings I talked about with the plot layer and the soil type and anything else. And I'm using that to do all that kind of intersection with other spatial data. And again, I mentioned these squirrely areas in the field. When you got yield data on your farm, there's no reason for you to clean that data or remove that data, because one of the things you're doing with yield maps is to identify the squirrely areas, because that's what you want to attack agronomically, figure out why they're squirrely and improve them. As researchers, though, when I've got these squirrely little pockets of red yield in the field that might unfairly influence this plot versus another, I want to get rid of them. So try and bring everything up to equal kind of comparison. And so we'll go in and remove the worst of these areas when we're doing a variety, not a variety trial, any trial. And then when we're done, we'll export the data from here into something I can bring into Excel and use Excel to process that clean yield data and get it into some plot averages or means that I can use for statistical analysis. You can almost stop there if you're just looking at the repeatability among reps. You can almost stop with Excel. But to take it all the way, you need some sort of a statistical package. Again, we've got site license for a big honking one called SAS on campus. Unfortunately, this is a big stumbling block. I've not yet found off-the-shelf, let alone free, package that works well for Joe Blow. And that still, for me, is a stumbling block. So, but that's probably what I bring to the table as a researcher, is I've got access to this, I've got access to that. You know, these are things we bring to the table when we're doing research with you. But again, both the data cleaning and the statistical analysis tend to be stumbling blocks if you're doing it yourself. And that's because you may not have access to the software may be too expensive, you may not have experience with GIS or statistics. But again, those kinds of skill sets and software, that's what the likes of us bring to the table when we collaborate with you, and that's part of our job. Okay, so, and I'm more than glad to do that part of it. But understand that if you're doing it yourself, that is a stumbling block. So there are challenges with field scale research, and I'd be remiss if I didn't admit that. While I say I welcome field variability, it can get a bit excessive. And once in a while we have to abandon a trial because there's just so much crap going on that we cannot get good research data out of it. Not very often, thankfully, do I have to give up on a trial. But once in a blue moon, this is one of our challenging fields. We've been in here a couple times with this grower. And I'm sort of naive. I mean, I get screwed one year, and 2 years later I come back and say, well, maybe it'll be better this year, and you put in another trial. But he's got these wet holes in this field that the way they're situated makes it really hard to sort of work with them, clean them, get rid of the data. So field variability can be too much. But I'd say, off the top of the head, I'd say 90% of the time we're okay with the fields that we're in. And it's just a small percentage. Sometimes recruiting collaborators to work with, or finding ones with the right combination of equipment and management attributes can be hard to find. For example, doing row spacing trials. I have always wanted to get 50 or 100 trials, field scale, looking at 20-inch row versus 30, or twins versus 30, or 15s versus 30. I would love to get that kind of huge farm scale type trials, because small plots with row spacing tends to get, let's just say, a little unreliable. But now I got to get 2 planters lined up, sometimes 2 headers lined up, sometimes sprayers, applicators. It gets a little hard. And so sometimes we just can't do field scale research because of equipment availability or compatibility. These technologies, John, some of them have quirks, some of them are not compatible, they don't play well with other things in the whole realm of things. It can be really frustrating at times. For example, you're doing and I haven't checked in a couple years. When we'd work with a guy, and I'm not bashing any color, but when we work with a guy with green equipment and a green controller, and we're doing we're doing a planting trial on a field that's, let's say, a bit odd shaped. Well, more than anything, a field that's not perfectly east-west or north-south. And so we create a prescription. We upload it to the green controller. The green controller at the time had a minimum pixel size of 30 feet. And so if he had variable planter control, or heaven forbid, variable row control, sometimes when the field's a little helter-skelter, and so, a straight line on a computer is not a straight line, it's a bunch of pixels, stair-step pixels, if you zoom in. So on a 30-foot pixel, sometimes as you're going down the field, the controller thinks it's crossed over into the next color prescription and changes it on us. And the first time this happened, actually one of my cooperators was planting on his own, because I assured him, don't worry, here's the prescription, just upload it, you don't need me there. And he calls me from the cab, he says, hey, this is doing squirrely things, it's changing on its own and it shouldn't be changing. I said, oh, you're crazy, it can't be doing that. I said, I don't make mistakes, And then I finally discovered it was this darn pixel size thing on green controllers. And so I talked to Green. And they said, well, yeah, it's 30 foot. And I said, well, why can't I make it smaller? With Ag Leader systems, not that I'm promoting, but I can get it down to as small of a pixel as I want by choosing it in the software. Well, I think in reality what Green did was, think about it. If you go from a 30-foot pixel to 5 or 10, that takes up a lot more memory in the display, because you've increased the number of pixels unbelievably. I think that's why Green did it, was to conserve memory in the controller. I don't know if they've changed it in the last couple of years or not, but that drove me nuts doing prescription trials with Green equipment. All right, so sometimes they've got these quirks and things that you got to be aware of. And as researchers, we often love to do really detailed manual data collection, and especially our grad students. We love to send our graduate students in our summer labor to the field and just all day long collect data. Small plots, you can get a lot of data per plot easily, but on half-mile throughs, 16 rows wide, it takes a long time to get a lot of detailed hand-gathered data. So that's sort of the compromise we make, is we don't get a lot of hand data, which is why we're intrigued with drones and using reflectance as a proxy for things like canopy cover or plant size or things like that. And that's why we're interested in drone imagery, to get us true whole field data collection. Okay. We meaning me and Jim Cambrato, our soil fertility guy, we began this Fieldscale stuff in 2006 with the simple goal of addressing issues that we felt were important to our corn growers. And at the time, in terms of agronomically, nitrogen and seed were at least half of the variable cost production for our growers, which meant that our guidelines were a bit out of date. And we said, okay, we really ought to make sure that our guidelines are current, so that, this half of the variable costs that you're using, that you're doing it the right way. So we focused on nitrogen and seed for a long time, seeding rates. And we also want to involve a greater number of county extension folk and local CCAs in doing these field scale trials, and a lot of the technology was starting to all come together. So we got involved with these trials. So since 2006, we've got about 250 nitrogen trials around the state, about 100 population trials. We've started these last 3 in recent years. We've got 32 starter trials, 16 with biological, in-furrow biological seed treatments, and now we're up to 12 on sulfur fertilizer. The yellow counties are where we've been in the state. The red dots are the Purdue farms. And so again, these on-farm collaborations not only give us more data in the database, but they allow us to get into areas of the state that the Purdue farms simply don't address. So different soils, different climate, other things. So it allows us to broaden the geographic extent of our efforts, because again, at the state level, as a state extension specialist, my job is to come up with recommendations for the state or for regions. And so I want as big of a geographic impact as I can get to come up with these guidelines. So because of that, we've been almost forced into focusing on a few number of topics in order to generate huge databases for each topic. And so we haven't had the luxury of looking at a boatload of different questions and topics. We focused on a few, the ones that I've shown you, in order to get these robust guidelines put together. We've been primarily funded with corn checkoff dollars and some internal Purdue dollars. Not a boatload of money by any stretch of the imagination. And in particular, we've never had enough money to compensate our collaborators for any yield losses they might incur as a result of playing with us in the field. And this is not universal around the country as to how this on-farm research is done. We just simply have never had the money to compensate someone for lost yield in a trial. So Jim and I worried about this for a long time. And we still feel guilty when we cost you, a bunch of money out of that trial. Honestly, we feel guilty. However, we do believe what the result has been is the guys who work with this are guys who are willing to risk that loss in order to learn something to improve the rest of their operation. So they're willing to take a hit on yield. They're willing to spend maybe extra money on that high end rate or whatever. They're willing to incur loss in order to learn. And I think because of that, we've ended up with collaborators that are better, good attention to detail, of true vested interest in the trial, and I think it's, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I think it's given us simply a lot better data. I've got colleagues that say we can't do graduate student research on these field scale trials. There's too much variability. These trials have supported for us the research of 12 graduate students in the past 13 years. And so we are using it for graduate student training. It is possible to use it for graduate student training, and we've been pretty successful with it. Because we're extension, and that's our primary responsibility, we're able to disseminate these results all over the state in a lot of different ways. And again, my role as a state extension specialist is to get this information out and get it out in a way that's reliable and robust for regions, if not statewide. And so we've been able to do that. So I'll just end by saying it does take a village to do this kind of work. By using field scale trials, both at our outlying Purdue farms, combined with collaborating farmers, it allows us to generate large data sets in a smaller amount of time so that we can get to guidelines sooner that are reliable and robust around the state. And frankly, our clientele are a little more receptive to these guidelines when they know it's coming from field scale trials and from real farms. And I chuckle at myself because when I was a young buck coming out of grad school doing small plot stuff at the Purdue farms, and farmers would roll their eyes at winter meetings and say, "Oh yeah, but that's not the real world." And being dutifully trained as a grad student, I said, "Oh no, trust me, it'll ramp up. It works. It works." But I will admit, after all these years, it is nice to be able to say, "Hey, this came from real farms and real fields and real variability," and there is a lot of credibility that comes along with that, and actually it makes it part of the fun for a lot of ways. So. With that, John, I think that's it. Thanks for the opportunity to come over. I appreciate it. And if there's any Indiana farmers in here or whatever, if you want to play with us, let us know. If you're Ohio farmers, I guess you can play with John and Elizabeth and them. If you're near the border, you might sneak over. Or if there's things we do together, as we've talked about, across the state lines to pool data across the state lines, there's opportunities for that. But on-farm research is good. And if done correctly, you can learn an awful lot from it. And it's really, I think it's a win-win for both sides. For us as a university and you as farmers, I think it's a win-win for both sides when it's done nice and done well. And